According to Ford, this Mustang Mach E is good for 270 miles of range. This has the largest battery pack currently available. It's about an 88 kilowatt hour battery pack, so bigger than the one that we find in the Model 3 or the Model Y. And this one is the dual motor vehicle. So this is not the GT, it's not the highest level of performance, but it does have better performance than the base model. Now, the one odd thing about EPA EV range estimates is that there is a great deal of variation because manufacturers are allowed to run two sort of different test cycles. You can run the complete suite of tests, or you can run a more limited suite of tests that's logically a little bit less expensive to run. Some manufacturers also choose a voluntary derating, and that can cause their EPA numbers to look an awful lot smaller than the real-world range. We see that in something like the Kia Niro EV. Or you can run the full suite of tests and not opt for any optional derating. That gives you the biggest number possible. We see that in all the Tesla vehicles out there. So the question I want to answer today is, how close does the Mach E come to its EPA range in real-world driving? Does it actually manage to exceed it like some people have been guesstimating out there? And of course, how close does this come to the Tesla Model Y? Now, there is one key thing you should know. The Ford Mustang Mach E is a little bit heavier than the Model Y, but it does have skinnier tires. If you take a look at the tires on this guy, they are narrower than the ones that we find in some Model Ys out there. And the tire size is probably one of the reasons that the Model Y is less efficient than the Model 3. These tires are 225s, and the last Model Y that I drove had 255 with tires on it. Definitely keep that in mind. But the rest of the vehicle is honestly very similar to the Model Y in terms of its general aerodynamic profile, actual aerodynamic numbers as well. Ground clearance is also not exactly high in the Mach E or in the Model Y. In fact, you'll get a little bit more ground clearance in something like the Polestar 2, which they're calling a sedan. And of course, Ford is liking to call the Mach E a crossover. So with all that out of the way, let's get out on the road. I'm going to do my usual test drive loop. Since so many people are complaining about that test drive loop, I'm also going to run this battery essentially all the way to the end, and we'll talk about how the range figures add up. Well, I've now finished my drive loop, and according to the numbers, I've averaged 3.3 miles per kilowatt hour over 61 miles of driving. Again, this is the same loop that I use on every new vehicle that we test here at Alex & Autos. Now, according to the numbers, that should give this car about 280 to 290 miles of real-world range. We've now reached 50% of battery charge, so we've used half the battery. We've gone 140.5 miles, and the car says we have 118 miles of range left. You can see it really is being quite pessimistic about that range figure, because if I truly have used half the battery, theoretically, I should be able to go another 140 miles for about 280 miles of total real-world range. Now we have to dissect that number a little bit and talk about comparisons. The Tesla Model Y in its real-world range test did 225 miles the last time I drove it. Now, one thing to keep in mind, I was using the air conditioning and the heat pump a little bit more than I was in this vehicle, so logically we should give that a bit of a bump up to about 250 miles for comparable conditions to what I've been driving in the Mach E right now. Now, the rest of the difference can be explained away in a few different ways. The first one is that Tesla has since improved the efficiency of the Model Y, so supposedly the new model is more efficient than the model that I was driving. The next thing you need to keep in mind is this vehicle does have a bigger battery pack. This battery pack is about 88 kilowatt hours versus 75 kilowatt hours in the Tesla Model Y. The next thing to know is the Model Y has pretty wide tires, and that's one of the reasons that in real world driving, you will notice the range is shorter than the Model 3, even though it really just looks like an overinflated Model 3. 255 width tires versus the 225 width tires on this model. Add that to the curb weight, etc., and that's why we see the variance here. So battery capacity, curb weight, tire size, all of that factors into the distance and the real world mileage score. So let's just keep driving this until the end of the battery. The battery is down to 30% now, and at this point I've gone all around the Bay Area. I've gone from San Jose down to Gilroy, all the way up to Larkspur, all the way back around the east side of the bay, and we still have 30% of the battery left. At this point in time, thanks to having the cruise control set to a slightly lower speed, 68 miles an hour, I did that because some folks complained that in some of the tests I was going a little too fast, 72, whatever, and some EV people might like to go a little slower. Definitely going slower is going to improve your range, absolutely positively. If you set the cruise control to 75 or 80 or 85 miles an hour like you can in Texas, expect any EV's range to get severely, severely cut. If you want a lithium-ion battery to last as long as possible, you don't ever want to fully charge it or fully discharge it, and you don't want it to spend a great deal of time at maximum charge or at minimum charge either. I'm really reminded of some of the early EVs we had in America, some of those under 100-mile EVs like the very first Nissan Leaf. A lot of folks bought them because they were on longer commutes and they wanted a low-cost vehicle to drive on those longer commutes. They wanted access to the carpool lane, etc. But the problem was they weren't really designed for their particular lifestyle and their particular commute. They thought they were. They thought, well, I have a 40-mile each-way commute or a 50-mile each-way commute, and the range of this car is 100 miles, so it should be good. But they forgot about the air conditioning, and they forgot about the heater, and they forgot about the fact that your mileage isn't going to be exactly the same as the battery starts to age. So over time, the range becomes less and less. They're using more and more of the battery in order to complete their daily commute. Maybe they decide to take a few trips here and there in the vehicle. Then they're charging to 100% every day and draining it all the way to 0 indicated on the display every day. And then they start to DC fast charge because they realize that I can't make it all the way to work and then all the way back home without DC fast charging. So I'll just stop and I'll give it a 15-minute top up. All of those things are going to degrade the battery faster and faster and faster, and then it sort of snowballs. But if you have a long-range EV like this, or a Model 3 or a Model Y, or any of the other over 200, over 300-mile range EVs, that's really not a problem, because if I were to drive this 50 or 60 miles a day, I'm using a very small portion of the battery, and that's really going to be good for battery health. The range indicator just dropped below 20 miles. It says we have 8% of the battery left available, but we're still continuing on. I think we'll just do one more lap around here. It's probably the same lap you've seen on the time lapse there for a while. It looks like it's going to be around 20 miles back to the office, something like that. So I suspect we'll be just fine, because this range estimator has been really pessimistic all day, I've got to say. The car's been averaging 3.3 miles per kilowatt hour so far today. And if you calculate that out, that's about 290 miles. I've already gone 260 miles according to the odometer. So even if we just get the 20 miles that it's indicating right there, that'll be over the EPA estimate of 270 miles. So it really does appear that Ford decided to be really, really cautious and really pessimistic with their particular range calculations. Now the car says I have 6 miles of range left and 2% battery. And it says that my destination is 7 miles away. So this could get just a little close. The car is saying charger distance critical. Nearest EV station is near edge of range. So it actually has told me that it knows that there's a DC fast charge station that I could use, and that I'm going to be in deep doo-doo if I miss it. So let's just go ahead and enter my destination here and see what the car calculates as far as charging time goes. So it really wants me to get off and use a DC fast charge station that is somewhat nearby. See if it gives me any information about it. It says I'm going to need to spend about 15 minutes there. So it's probably a good idea to do what the car says at this point. I have 1% battery left. So let's just cruise on into that station. I'll have 3 miles of range when I arrive, and we'll see if this works. Now, before we actually get to the charger, let's talk about my final range number here. I ended up at 278 miles here, it looks like. And according to this, I still have about 5 miles of total range left. So as far as the range estimates go, that sounds about right. Now, rather unfortunately, the charging station that I know I'm headed to is not the fastest one on the planet here. So it'll be interesting to see how much time it takes me to get charged there. So I stopped here at the Whole Foods. The chargers were all available and they're all operating. Unfortunately, they're not the fastest ones. These charge at 80 kilowatts maximum. Right now, it looks like the battery is sucking down 67 kilowatts. Now, quick commentary on charging networks. I get asked this question a great deal. At the moment, these are all the chargers near me. You can see them right there on the phone that support charging this vehicle at its fastest rate possible. These are over 120 kilowatt chargers. Now, if I were to adjust this filter and say just any old DC fast charger that is compatible with this vehicle, then we get a much more densely populated map, as you can see right there. Now, I get asked this question a great deal about the differences between charging networks, so let's take a look and see how that compares to the supercharger locations. As you can see, those are all the supercharger locations in the same area. So, reasonable quantity, actually, of CCS charge connectors. Not all of them are able to charge as fast as those supercharger connectors, but the locations are actually a pretty decent spread. And it is worth noting that not all the superchargers on that map are actually able to charge as fast as this car is. So if I change it over to that mode to only display Tesla superchargers that are capable of 120 kilowatts max, then we actually get a map that is substantially similar to the CCS charging network, at least in this area. Now, again, things vary a lot, and the number of plugs in the stations, etc., there is a definite difference between the Tesla supercharging network and CCS. So CCS tends to have more stations. In fact, there are actually more stations in the US that have CCS plugs, but each of those stations doesn't have many connectors. So this station has 4 CCS connectors that support this vehicle and pretty much every other new EV out there except for Tesla. And then there are 4 connectors that support the Nissan Leaf, the Kia Soul, and then with an adapter, some Teslas, although those will charge slower. So now that that's covered and we have 25 miles of range, it's time to get back out on the road.